Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today I have with me Nancy Rekow, Bainbridge Island poet and poet activist. She grew up in deep New Jersey country, 30 miles from Manhattan, in a house filled with books, surrounded by orchards, fields, woods, streams, and wildflowers. She majored in English at Oberlin College, lived and worked 4 years in Manhattan, taught grade school 6 years, including 2 in England for USAF, toured Europe, then married an attorney and moved to an old farm on Bainbridge Island. There she had 4 children, and she has lived on Bainbridge ever since. In 1974, she joined a poetry workshop taught by Bob McAllister, a self-dubbed Mad Priest of Bainbridge Island, which changed her life and indeed has inspired many local poetry activities that continue today. Soon Nancy began publishing poems and became a co-teacher with Bob, who recently died in 2015. Now, after 43 years, Nancy still continues these weekly workshops. Over the years, she has edited, published, and helped others publish over 25 books, in recent years through Northwest Trillium Press with her late husband, Everett Thompson, also a local poet. Over the years, she has sometimes been a poet in the Bainbridge schools. She has worked with Arts Humanities Bainbridge, publishing the Northwest Poets and Artists Calendar, with monthly poetry readings at the Paul's Bohemian Coffee House, now in their 24th year, with annual San Carlos poetry readings, now in their 33rd year, and with annual Poetry Corners and Readings, now in their 18th year, sponsored by Arts Humanities Bainbridge. She also works with Ars Poetica, which is in its 6th year, featuring jury-selected poems interpreted by West Sound artists in any medium, with displays and readings in 4 different regional venues. I am sure Nancy and I are going to have a lot to talk about. Welcome to the program, Nancy.
Thank you, Sheila.
I'm so glad you're here. I just don't know where to start. After reading your bio, the first thing that strikes me is where you grew up was probably very inspiring for a future poet.
Oh, yes.
Were you writing poetry as a kid?
Some, but the main thing was the house was filled with books, and it was very isolated. I was the oldest child, so I didn't have anybody to play with when I was young, very much at all. I was very shy and insecure, but I read books all the time, and I wandered around in nature. And that nature thing shows up in my poems a lot.
And then, of course, you moved to Bainbridge Island, surrounded by some of the same feeling.
Definitely.
So you had to have a lot of nature in your poems and in your being.
There is a lot of nature in my poems, definitely, and I'm aware of that, and noticing that other people don't put any nature in their poems. They're very great at conversation, for instance. I know one of your questions was, what kind of poems do I write? I would say, on the whole, they're pretty straightforward. I want them to be accessible to the reader.
That makes me want to read what you handed me this morning, which is your 10 Secrets of Good Writing. I'm going to read the 10 secrets, and then you're going to tell us something about how you use them, maybe in your writing. You started to already. Be original.
Don't ever use cliches. Let it come from inside yourself. Choose words that haven't been heard together very much.
It's original. It's a straightforward way of saying something new.
Originally, yes.
Use specific details, and I'm guessing that part of what you mean by straightforward is that these are specific images.
These are real.
Use all 5 senses. Are they all equal, or do you find some more difficult to put into poems?
Oh, yes. Easiest is what you see. I'm very strongly visual, so I find it really easy to use visual imagery, but there are also the others, sound, smell, touch.
Taste.
Uh-huh.
I always strive, if I can, to use smell and taste because they're harder.
Yes,
I think visual comes first, and feelings, have the texture of things, and hearing, I think, would be third. Use similes and metaphors. Mm-hmm. So do you find that a difficult thing to teach to people?
It depends on the person. I find in teaching poetry all these years to groups that each person has his or her own particular gifts. Some people are great at similes and metaphors. Some people are extremely rhythmical. Their words work well together. They're all different. They all have strengths, and then they have other things they need to work more on.
Mm-hmm. I think that, I know for me coming to poetry, making metaphor was very difficult. Now it's just as easy as any other kind of thinking that I do, but it took some practice. And I think it was because when you're going through academia, metaphor isn't exactly what they want.
Right. And I should add into that early life stuff that one reason I loved books and was so fond of words and all is that my mother read to me every single day before my nap and before bed and other times too. So my sisters and I all grew up listening to stories and words all the time.
So you had some very good auditory training.
Mm-hmm.
So that comes to number 5. Read your words aloud, then listen, tighten, and revise.
Yes.
So when you read them aloud, what happens?
You hear things that aren't needed, like extra the or and, or sometimes repeating a word to get more emphasis, repeating things for the rhythm of it. And that takes practice.
When you say that your poems were straightforward, I think you might also mean you are taking to heart the adage that we should write in the language of the everyday person. However, poetry requires more rhythm, perhaps, than the everyday person, or more compression, and more specificity.
I remember years ago when I was studying at Centrum at the Writers' Conference, I read a poem out loud to this small group of women who were in my poetry workshop up there. Afterwards, they were much younger than I was. They said, "Oh, that poem sounds as if it was written by a little girl." And I know what they mean.
But a little girl couldn't have written it if it's a good poem. And then that's part of the trick, is getting back to that freshness we had as children. You and I both know the poet Jim Mitsui, who was from Seattle and taught in Renton for a long time. And he told me a story, maybe he told you the story, of an example, I think it was true though, of a little girl pointing at the moon and saying, "Daddy, Daddy, there's a fingernail in the sky."
Oh, lovely.
And Daddy saying, "No, that's the moon." And he told us that story as a way to help us realize that this magical, wonderful way that children can see the world is often drained from us by adults who don't want us to be imprecise. But we find that using metaphor, we get more and more precise about the feelings.
Jim Mitsui years ago told me an assignment he gives to his students often, and I've used it since then with all different ages as a first assignment often for adults in my workshops or for school kids, first graders, middle school students, whatever. The assignment is pretty simple. It's think up an experience you've had in your life any time. It can be 20 years ago, it can be yesterday, but it's a memory you have that's very, very vivid, very important to you emotionally, either brings a strong feeling of joy or fear or terror or question or whatever. Then write a poem about it using these specific feelings, conveying them, but not telling them, showing them. Use at least several similes and metaphors. Try to use as many sense impressions as you can. And invariably, that assignment brings out wonderful poems.
Because we experience and re-experience through the 5 senses. But something happens when we attempt to write where we vague out. I guess I call it that. We use cliches or we...
generalizations.
Right.
And that's why he said, use an experience that is so vivid in your mind, and that will make it a good poem because you remember.
That's great. So here we are, number 6. Use strong active verbs.
Oh, yes.
And what does that mean?
Verbs are the strongest words in the language because they are active. If somebody smashes into a tree, that's very strong. The second strongest words in the language are the nouns, the things. And the critic John Ciardi said many years ago, as you know, Sheila, nouns and verbs are the strongest words in the language, and that most good poems have at least twice as many nouns and verbs as they have adjectives and adverbs. And so when I was first writing in my classes with Bob McAllister, I used to actually go through my poems and count up the adjectives and adverbs and see how many of them I could scratch out.
When you use one of those, it has to be really powerful.
Yes.
And I was studying with Richard Blessing, and I had written a poem about my father. At the ending of it had to do with our front lawn, which, of course, he mowed in suburban New Jersey. And
so did I. Yeah.
Richard Blessing said, "You need an adjective here," which was very unusual. But I needed an unusual. Couldn't be our long
rhythmically
grass, right? So I thought, and I finally came up with aspiring. our aspiring front lawn, which was in keeping with my dad's goal of making it in the corporate hierarchy. I'm very proud of that adjective.
Yes, there you go. Well, actually, years ago, I read a book by John Updike, and he was giving an example of this very thing about nouns and verbs and adjectives. So he made up this sentence. The nouns and verbs were all lounging about on the grass. Suddenly, an adjective walked by in all her dark beauty. I often quote that to students.
Yeah. I like that. I wonder if your associative poetry brain went from my father's lawn in my poem to
John Updike.
Updike. Okay. I was thinking of John Gardner momentarily because, again, as poets, we associate. And his book, The Art of Fiction, where he has an exercise about describing a lake from the point of view of a person who's fallen in love, and then describe the same lake from the point of view of a person who's just committed a murder.
Oh, right.
And of course, that will require that you look at the specifics, that that person sitting there is looking at the specific landscape and any animals, bird life that's there.
Right.
So it is one of the tricks, one of the 10 secrets of good writing. I think I would add an 11th, is be associative, which is what we're doing.
Let your mind go where it will.
Absolutely. Whereas a fiction writer colleague of mine says, keep it weird.
Well, weird is good, but I like to communicate with the reader.
Right. Weird that they can understand.
Right.
But sometimes our most original, to use the number 1, be original, sometimes our most original thought or connection to an image seems to us weird.
Oh, yes.
And that nobody else would understand it.
But if it's working, then that's a sign.
Right. And usually it does reach other people because it's so idiosyncratic.
If it connects. I did make this list up many years ago when I was asked to teach a class in writing. They said I had to have some agenda, some plan. So I made up these 10 secrets of good writing, and I've used them ever since with all different ages.
They're wonderful, and we're only on 8 now, but I already want to add a 12th.
Oh, okay.
And that is when you said they needed some sort of agenda. I think in some ways that's very hard for a poet, because our best poems come when we have a feeling, a kernel, something that strikes us, but no agenda, no intention. It's going to take us somewhere. And to quote Jim Mitsui again,
that's true.
I think it's even in a poem where he says, all those people following their keys home. That writing to an ending you already know isn't really writing.
No, and ideally, as Bob McAllister always said, when you start a poem, you hardly ever know how it's going to end. If you have an ending in mind, that's kind of suspicious.
Yes.
It takes you somewhere. It's a journey.
Exactly, which is, we'll get back to it, is why I think we write, to take that journey.
If you just joined us on KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend, you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life with Sheila Bender. Today, Sheila is talking with Bainbridge Island poet and longtime poetry facilitator Nancy Rekow about the history of her teaching and community poetry projects.
So 8, vary your sentence structure.
Well, it depends where people went to school and how much grammar they learned. But I find nowadays that probably most of the people who come to my workshops, and they're some wonderful poets, tend to not vary their sentence structure enough, especially at the beginning of a poem, for instance. They often will just start subject, verb. The boy jumped off the cliff, blah, blah, blah. But if you start with something else, that afternoon, or before I could stop him, something, a clause or an infinitive or whatever, that keeps up the suspense longer, and it varies the poem, the writing.
Do you find this to be an age-related situation, that younger people are using less complicated or complex sentences?
Possibly, yes, although lately I haven't been teaching younger people. I've been teaching adults. And it depends who their teacher is. I've taught poetry for some teachers who are very, very good at teaching grammar.
I'm just wondering if texting is changing the way people
Oh, yes.
write.
undoubtedly.
And then I'm going back in my mind to you being read to so much by your mother and having all these books. So complex sentences and sentence variation is very much in your background and in your ears and in your training. And it just might be something that we're losing, which is sad.
Right. And my teacher in 7th and 8th grade, I went to a small school with 2 grades in a room, by the way, because I lived in the deep country, 30 miles from Manhattan. If I hurried up, I could get all my work done and sit and read books most of the day.
So you were really immersed.
But anyway, my 7th and 8th grade teacher was very, very good at teaching grammar. She had us do diagramming, which I loved.
Me too.
So that makes me very aware of sentence structure.
Therefore, even the most accessible poem may sound like it's in everyday speech, but it isn't.
Right.
And that's one of the tricks. So now we have 9, show, don't tell. And here I know that you've already said that we need to use specific details, but there's one you've added here in show, don't tell, which I think is really important. We don't think about it necessarily with poetry, but that's quoting. To use quotes is a way of showing.
Yes, that will work depending on the poem.
Because when somebody says something in your poem, it's an image, it's a sound image that's lodged in your ears, I think.
Right.
And it shows emotion.
And there are so many fabulous quotes over the centuries that can really lead a person into the poem, maybe used as a title or used in the first line or even in a subtitle.
How about direct speech? When you remember what somebody said.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It puts you right in the room or the landscape
right there.
With that person.
Yes.
And finally, if you're not going to accept my extra 2, finally is number 10. Write what you know, what you've experienced in your own natural spoken language.
Yes, Bob McAllister always taught us that. And all these poetry happenings, many of them would not be happening at all if it weren't for him. What you know is very individual. None of us know the same things exactly. And so when we use that in a poem, it's very powerful and original. And the reason I started talking about Bob McAllister is he encouraged us to use more concrete Anglo-Saxon words like hand, woods, tree, baby, and so on, rather than multisyllabic Latinate words, which of course are fine when they work, when we need them, but avoid the long Latinate stuff for the most part.
You and I are both transplants from the East Coast. I grew up not in the woods in New Jersey, and maybe less than 30 miles from Manhattan, but certainly East Coast. And when I started writing poetry is when I met you first, years and years ago now, in David Wagner's poetry class.
Right.
I was very aware of the Northwest poetry idea or inclination to use these Anglo-Saxon words. The East Coast poetry that I was familiar with used a lot more abstract words.
Stuffy.
Yeah. Today, I really can't read those poems very well because my brain has been converted. I'm happy for that conversion.
Good. Yes. Congratulations.
So, thank you. Now that we've gone through the 10 secrets of good writing and heard so much about the fabulous way you teach, actually, as well.
And you. I've heard the same thing about you.
Well, both started out with degrees in English and teaching. You taught grade school. I taught middle school. It was in some ways very fortunate to move from that to writing poetry because if you're a good teacher, you're person-centered and you really listen to your students. I'm sure you did that. And if you're writing poetry, you're really listening to your poems. As you said, you read them aloud, you hear the needed rhythms, things like that, and you don't have an intention. The poem tells you where it wants to inform you. Just like I think a student who's learning tells you what it is he or she needs to learn. And raising children. This is going to be my segue to we both started writing poetry when our children were all school age and we had some time, or in my case, preschool age, and we had some time. So what brought you to poetry?
Basically, growing up in a house filled with books and reading all the time.
Reading poetry as well. As
poetry. My grandmother always sent me books of poetry for birthday and Christmas, and I read them over and over.
So you had that in your background.
Yes.
But then you weren't writing your own poems.
No. I fiddled with words all through grade school and high school and
But something
college.
drove you into the community of writers on Bainbridge. How did that happen?
Because I signed up for that creative writing workshop taught by Bob McAllister, who was an English teacher at the high school, along with my late husband, Everett Thompson. They taught there for 30 years. And Bob McAllister started teaching these workshops. They were extension courses for Olympic College. I signed up for one. I hadn't been out of the house to take a class for years. That did it, the very first night.
You told me an amusing story that once you started, you wanted to keep on.
Oh, yes.
And you had a tactic for that. Tell us
yes.
about it.
Well, for one thing, we would phone all the students and encourage them to keep coming. Sometimes be quite direct about that. But sometimes not enough people would sign up because it was an extension course and you were supposed to go sign at one particular time. So sometimes we would sign up our dogs.
And what would happen if they didn't show up? Or did they?
Well, years later, Olympic College, somebody from there phoned me or something and said, whose Social Security numbers were these?
And did you have an answer?
Oh, I made something up, I guess.
Well, I want to make sure we have some time to talk about what happened in your career. You were writing, you were publishing your poems, you were teaching with Bob, you became a co-teacher, you eventually took over the workshops.
Because he was so busy building houses and directing dramas and acting and...
I mean, you had found him and he had found you, which is wonderful. And now you continue to do the workshops. Before me on the table here, between us, are so many books that you are responsible, and calendars that you are responsible for getting out into the world. So besides writing and teaching, you've been involved in community projects that have brought poetry forth.
A lot of editing, too. I do a lot of editing.
Editing of poems.
And books, various things.
And you have some publishing experience in Manhattan. So what I really love is how we think that poetry maybe is aside from the rest of our lives, but things start to accumulate.
Yes.
So I could just reach in and pick up anything here for us to talk about. But let's start with some of the community projects. I have a collection of Ars Poetica poems from 2014, one of the projects that I think you said was 8 years old. And that you're six. You're very involved in it. Tell us about Ars Poetica and what we can expect from it.
It was started 6 years ago by Collective Visions Gallery in Bremerton. The woman who was directing back then got this idea to have a poetry competition and then show all the poems to the artists, and they could each choose a poem to illustrate in any medium whatsoever, sculpture or yarn or whatever. I was recommended to her by Mike Dillon, who's married to one of the artists at the time, because he said, well, Nancy has this big, long publicity list, knows how to get in touch with poets. So I said, fine, I'll tell the poets. But I said, in order for this project to be respected, you need to have the poems juried. At first, they weren't listening to that at all, but I talked strongly about it. I said, otherwise, the poets won't respect this competition. I got to be one of the 2 jurors and have been each year it's been done.
Well, you carry on.
That's a great honor.
And it's a wonderful thing for poets and artists, and brings up an interesting thing in the poetry world. It's cooperative in that the workshops and the fostering of activities for everybody, but there's also competition so that people feel like it matters, being the best you can be matters, and that you can someday arrive. And
that communication between the poet and the visual artist is very special.
You used to do a Northwest Poets and Artists calendar, which you no longer do. Probably everyone's using their Google calendar. It's quite beautiful. And then you helped an interesting woman on Bainbridge Island prepare a book called Minnie Rose Lovegreen's Recipe for Raising Chickens, which is a fabulous how-to on raising chickens.
It's now sold over 26,000 copies. She kept calling me, this old woman with a British accent, and talked and talked and talked. She was offering us a German Shepherd dog for our farm. And finally, on about the 4th call, I said, okay, we'll drive over and see your dog and talk to you. So that was how I met her. She talked on and on. Fascinating and a great talker. And then I hired her to babysit and advise me for years. And I knew she wanted to publish a book about raising chickens. So
you did it.
She was diagnosed with cancer, and I took the ferry into the hospital, to her hospital bed, and with my tape recorder, and said, okay, Minnie Rose, now we're starting your book.
Right.
And then there was all her own words.
Are you talking about this one or the chicken?
Both.
Okay, because then the chicken book came first, How to Raise
yes.
Chickens. And then, far as I can remember, An Immigrant Woman's Story, 1888 to 1975 is one of the ones you're talking about now, oral history, her words.
Both.
Our oral histories. Wonderful. And then it led eventually to Chicken Raising Tales from Bainbridge Island Tour de Coupe. It's a lovely book with pictures of people's chicken coops. And all of this is done before all the self-publishing stuff. So you had a big hand in making these books come into being. Just beautiful books. And we don't have time to go into them all. And so therefore, including collected poems by Bob McAllister called Even in the Wind, Even in the Dark. I wish he was sitting here with us. Maybe in some way he and Everett are.
I think he is.
We'll have to have another session where we talk more.
One thing I forgot to say just quickly is that the Ars Poetica project with the poets and the artists has now expanded, so it's in 4 different local venues now each year.
So if people want to get on your mailing list so that next year they hear about Ars Poetica or any of the other projects that you're involved in, how do they do that?
Well, Ars Poetica does have a website, Gail Thompson, who runs it now. I'm simply a, quote, advisor, unquote. But also they could email me, Nancy Rekow, R-E-K-O-W, at msn.com.
Nancy, I'd love to hear one of your poems.
I'll read this one we have here in a book. The assignment was to write a poem using some of our favorite words, images, and I had figured out what were my favorites, using one of them at least 3 times, the others at least twice in the poems. I was just fiddling with these words, and it suddenly came to me a game my sisters and I used to play when we were young. The game was called Stone Baby, and that's the title of the poem. Before I wrote this poem, I'd read an article, very scary article, about a woman who'd been abused by her husband, and she got so distressed that she threw her 2 babies off a bridge, quote, to save them from hellfire. So I'm thinking about that and words, that images, stone and baby. I realized there was that game we used to play. So this is what I wrote. She sits in her stone house, closes the curtains, waits as dark fills the room like water. Somewhere beyond the window, the trees stir. The sun sets them on fire. Once she wanted sun, wanted fingers in her hair, wore dresses. Once she sat with her sisters playing Stone Baby. If you hold the stone unguessed, you move to a higher step. No one told her stones could grow. There are trees surrounding the house where the man she married sleeps. They smother the house with leaves so dry that rubbing together 2 small stones could ignite them. Now she grips the bed's iron bridge, invites cold to her bones. Let's go. So slow she falls as wind unwinds her long hair from its nest. The trees curtain past until the river sheathes her. She drifts down. Silver knives of fish pass in and out of her body. At the bottom, she kneels in stones. Here the babies swim to her. Here they suck the sweet mud from her breasts.
Very powerful and accessible and direct. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It was fun.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.